Comrades, friends, good evening. It's wonderful to see you. I thank you for coming out on this rainy night. And I thank all that you are doing here in Boulder. Many of you are friends, fellow activists, and you have made an enormous difference in this community. And I always am, honored and thrilled to speak in an event sponsored by the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. We have KGNU, which is one of the best community radio stations in the country. We have Left Hand Books. We have a number of things here that we should be really thankful for, but not take for granted. So your participation and your support in these institutions are absolutely critical. So I thank all of you. You know who you are. Well, since the last time I spoke in Boulder, we have all suffered a huge loss. And I want to talk a little bit about my dear friend and mentor, Howard Zinn, who passed away on January 27th. I was to fly to LA to meet him the very next day and to do an interview. So it was a particular shock to learn of Howard's death. And what an extraordinary man, what an incredible life he led. 87 years of much of it of activism, even though he was a World War II bombardier, he saw the folly of war and the violence of war and became a pacifist. He became a Gandhian, if you will, someone who practiced civil disobedience and nonviolence. He also became a great historian, perhaps one of our greatest historians. It was Howard Zinn who dug into the past of the United States and uncovered hidden nuggets, absolute jewels that were hidden in the rough. And he was able to, sort of extract them and polish them and present them in A People's History of the United States, his landmark book, which has now sold 2 million copies. Its first edition in 1980, published by Harper. It was Harper and Row then. It was only 5,000 copies. They spent no money on publicity. There were virtually no reviews. This has been an example of the power of truth being spread simply by word of mouth. This is even before the internet. Since the internet, since Good Will Hunting, when Matt Damon told Robin Williams that he should read A People's History of the United States, or even before Howard Zinn was mentioned on The Sopranos and The Simpsons and other TV and popular media, this book had become really, I don't want to use a word like a Bible, but a kind of a grail, a kind of touchstone for citizens who wanted to feel something different about the United States. Something, feel some pride in a country, not the country of carpet bombing in Indochina, the destruction of Iraq, the invasions of Panama and Grenada, the attack on the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the attack on the FMLN in El Salvador, the unrelenting support for Israeli occupation and annexation. So Howard Zinn was able to do that. And I think we are all richer, not just better informed, but as citizens, yes, there is that America that we are trying to change. But there is also another United States. And on that day, there was a wonderful memorial service at the Arlington Church in Boston, right on the Boston Common. It was on Saturday, a beautiful Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Sun was shining, clear skies. And there was a number of people there who came to honor Howard. And this was the Arlington Church, incidentally, has a great pedigree. It was one of the major stopping points in the Underground Railroad. And more recently, in the 60s and 70s, This is where the draft cards were burned. This is where Chomsky and Zinn and others spoke during the 60s and 1970s. And just to give you an idea of some of the people that came and spoke that day, and in the audience was Eddie Vedder. Might not ring a bell with some of our older friends here this evening. Eddie Vedder is one of the most popular musicians in the United States today. He's the lead singer in Pearl Jam, a very popular group. David Harrington was there. Who's David Harrington? The founder and creator of the Kronos Quartet, the leading avant-garde string quartet, perhaps in the world. Theo Epstein was there to honor Howard. Theo Epstein. General manager of the Boston Red Sox. Howard was a great Red Sox fan. And Matt Damon, of course, who grew up next to Howard and Roz Zinn in their home in Auburndale. So young Matt used to come as a little boy and get cookies that Roz had baked and take them back to his house. And then great historians, Marilyn Wright Edelman was there as well, Marge Piercy, the poet. Chomsky, of course, spoke. Arundhati Roy was there from India. Naomi Klein was there from Canada. It was just an amazing gathering, if I could use a Sanskrit word, mishbuka. You know, that is the collective family. It's actually Yiddish. I didn't see a lot of Sanskrit speakers here. But, you know, the whole mishbuka was there, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful occasion. So I just wanted to, as they say, share that with you. And Howard lives. He lives through us. He lives through the truth, and his work will inspire for generations to come. Now, the announced topic for this evening is Obama's foreign policy, old wine, new bottle. I noticed in the press release that the S had been dropped, which I thought was rather amusing. Only one bottle, but it should be old wine and new bottles. And I've come here not to bury Obama. He's doing a good job of that himself. But I think it's important to point out the pattern of behavior, if I could use that term, of American presidents, which is rather consistent, be it a Republican or a Democrat, a conservative or a liberal. It has been, particularly and most urgently, since 1945, to protect and project the interests of the U.S. empire. Of course, an empire that doesn't exist. It only exists in the minds of a few crazed leftists and other marginal thinkers in the country. And an empire requires an empire of words. And this is something I've been thinking about lately. The relationship between a particular vocabulary and lexicon with the structure of hegemonic rule, with the framework of domination and power. And as you know, I'm very modest and I don't like to boast, but the fact is that in one of my earliest interview was with Confucius. That wasn't a laugh line. And, you know, it was difficult. You know, there were no tape recorders. It took ages to set it up. You know, I had to go to China. Finally I got Chomsky to intervene for me, and Confucius gave me an audience. And then I didn't know how to address him, because I didn't know if Confucius was his first name or his last name. So I just said, Mr. Confucius. And I had one question for him, for which I traveled all the way from this continent to China. I said, Mr. Confucius, if you were the ruler of the kingdom, what would be the first thing you would do? Well, he just laughed at me. He said, are you kidding? You know what I'm about. I'm into philosophy. I'm into the meaning of life, the Tao, meditation. I'm not interested in these temporal issues that, you journalists trying to get out of me. And I said, please, Mr. Confucius, I've traveled, I've used up all my frequent flyer miles to come here on ship at that time. I can't go back now empty-handed. And he said, okay, what I would do is rectify the language. And that was it. Interview over. Rectify the language. And this is, in fact, in his Analects. If you look at the Analects of Confucius, I don't make everything up, just some things. He talks about the absolute criticality of rescuing language from propaganda, from rescuing language from the imperial tapestry that is woven around words in order to numb us, in order to make reality obtuse and opaque. And coming right down to the modern period, you see that in the writings of Orwell, George Lakoff, Noam Chomsky, and others who have talked about the primacy of language. Because when you surrender the language, when you surrender the vocabulary to them, they've basically got you in a box. Because you are discussing the issues within the terminology that they have defined. So you can just see this on any given occasion, in the media. What are we going to do about Afghanistan? See there, right there, the embedded assumption that the U.S. has some right, obligation, duty, moral calling to do something about another country. What if an Afghan were to pose that question in the Afghan media? What are we going to do about the United States? What are we going to do about NATO forces that are occupying our country since 2001? I see the giggles made the point. So this whole issue of language, I think, is very, very critical. There are so many obvious examples. I'll just go over some of the ones, and I know there are a couple of people here who remember the Vietnam period. Just one, I can see. One, yeah, maybe. And that was the time of strategic hamlets. Well, that sounded wonderful. Strategic hamlet. Who's against strategic hamlet? Nice little village, a little mall, maybe a drugstore, ice cream parlor, strategic hamlet. Those were the concentration camps that the U.S. forces were driving the Vietnamese, our so-called allies, into. Those were strategic hamlets. Then from Vietnam, we also had protective reaction strikes. Well, that seems very honorable and logical. We want to protect ourselves, so we react. In fact, if we had decoded the propaganda at the time, these would have been described as first strikes, aggressive attacks. But the U.S. always hides behind the mantle of defense. Everything is clothed in respectability and also benign intent. So yes, the apologists for imperialism like Thomas Friedman and David Brooks and all the others who are getting, huge salaries in the media, they will say, yes, the U.S. Makes mistakes, honest mistakes, tragic they may be, but they are mistakes, and overall the intention is disinterested and benign. A complete denial of imperialism. Coming down to the current period, you have such euphemisms, and Orwell talks about this in Politics in the English Language, using euphemisms, again, to block thought, to absolutely immobilize and paralyze your brain cells so you simply don't know what's going on. Collateral damage. Okay, I would submit that the English language has suffered enormously from collateral damage over the last 30 years. We always think automatically of the Nazis and Goebbels as the masters of propaganda with their staged events and torchlight parades and swastikas and Leni Riefenstahl documentaries. But compared to the system that exists here, inside the empire, they were mere pikers. They were amateurs and could only turn green with envy at the tools that this empire has at its disposal. And propaganda plays a significant role and a crucial role in so-called liberal democracies. This goes back to David Hume, English philosopher in the 18th century, when he said that liberal democratic societies have less option to use force than, say, totalitarian states. So if you're in North Korea or Stalinist Russia or Mussolini Italy, if you step out of line, you're going to get bopped. You know that. And so you adjust accordingly. But in liberal democratic societies, such as the United States, force is less of an option. This is not to say it is not an option, as Black Panthers found out in the 1960s and 1970s, as members of the American Indian movement found out, as the Young Lords found out, and other groups, SDS as well, infiltrated. There were agents provocateurs. Let's go bomb the post office. Let's go kill somebody in order to generate more violence. So the ability of the state here is less. There's less of a propensity to use violence against its own citizenry. This is not to say, if push came to shove and the actual structure of elite power were threatened, that they would not turn the guns on the population. Just look at what's happening in the streets of Greece, where the police today are protecting whom? They are the strike force for the state, for the financial institutions, for the banks, against the people. And their force is being used to crush that uprising. Now, it's interesting how, again, in what I call, we are living in late empire America. This is last tango in Waziristan, period. The decline and fall of the U.S. In terms of historical precedents is quite sharp and unusual, and it's been rather rapid. So again, this is a very dangerous time because a wounded bull kicks the hardest. That's a South African proverb. So there's a likelihood for even more violence coming from the state. Here again is a perfect use of Orwell's language, and now I'm going to do some Orwellisms with you. The United States never uses violence. It uses force. Only our enemies use violence. Number one. We have leaders who lead administrations. They have warlords and hardliners who lead regimes. We conduct military operations. They carry out ambushes and sneak attacks. You can imagine, why aren't those dreaded Taliban, whether they're in Afghanistan or Pakistan, or Iraqis or Yemenis or Somalis, all of whom are being bombed now in one shape or form, all 5 countries. I don't know how well that is known here. Do we expect those fighters who have basically AK-47s and pistols and maybe a few RPGs to come out in the village square and wave at the helicopter gunships overhead and say, here we are, let's have a free and fair fight? Of course they're going to use ambushes. Of course they're going to use sneak attacks. Of course they're going to use the civilian population. That's exactly what the American colonists did from 1776 to 1783. They hid with the population. That was their cover and their strength. Our people, and you notice this particularly whenever Israel comes up, our people live in neighborhoods. Their people live in strongholds. Right? again, with speaking specifically of Israel, I think Israel, from the very beginning, had an enormous lexical advantage when it was able to seize and cement the idea of settler and settlement, which I think resonates with a lot of Americans. Oh, they're settlers. They're settling a land without people. They're putting settlements down. What could be wrong with that? Isn't that like a wonderful thing? Rather than the exact English, which would be colonization, colonies. This is a colonization project. This is not simply settlements. Very interesting how that is used. We, again, the U.S. military, we carry out, military operations with, fancy names, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom and Liberation. Although, how can you, these people are so illiterate, how can you endure freedom? You endure a hardship. I mean, they're actually illiterate here. The invasion of an occupation of Afghanistan is called Operation Enduring Freedom. The GIs on their gravestones have that particular phrase. Killed, during defending, of course, always defending his country. Our brave men and women in uniform, that's another automatic phrase that just comes streaming out of the mouths of politicians. You see on their gravestones, killed during Operation Enduring Freedom. The people who are enduring the U.S. occupation are, of course, the beleaguered Afghans, who are now in the 9th year of a U.S. NATO military occupation of their country with no end in sight. So here you see the foreign policy of Barack Obama, which, if people were paying attention during the campaign, should have been quite clear. He said on numerous occasions that Iraq was a mistake and that if Afghanistan was the war that was worth fighting, a just war, a war, again, another Sanskrit word, right? Chutzpah. During his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, he used that speech, not only invoking the name of Martin Luther King Jr., but he used the speech to defend a military aggression. That was rather stunning. And, of course, the response here was silence or simply bewilderment. Obama has expanded the war greatly into Pakistan. And drone attacks. Oh, you hear, there was a drone attack. Again, another euphemism. Why not call it a bombing? That's what it is. It's run by the CIA, which is a civilian agency that is now doing the work of the United States Air Force. I guess it's a division of labor. Maybe the Air Force is too busy bombing Somalia and Yemen and, defending us against, the North Korean or, Iranian attack, which is imminent, as we speak. There are worthy and unworthy victims. We see this all the time you can see it in the Daily Camera. Whenever someone dies in the U.S. military from this area, there's photographs, there are interviews with parents, and you learn all about this person. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think people should do that. But we never hear about the victims of our violence. They are invisible. They are, and again, the language here is theater. The U.S. military talks about the Iraqi theater, the Afghan theater, the Yemeni theater, the Somali theater, the Pakistan theater, or the AFPAC theater. And then there are actors, non-state actors and state actors. And what about the people? Well, the people are relegated to the shadows. They have a few walk-on lines, and they mumble in languages that no one can understand. Pashto, Punjabi, Dari, Farsi, Arabic. etc. They are to be just there as backdrop material, because it's always about the U.S. It's always about America, America's interests. And what are America's interests? Well, when I hear a phrase like that, I'm sure you do as well, the national interest. Wow, I feel so much better, don't you? With this, something, maybe it's like the National League, if you're into baseball, or the National Football League, National Hockey League. Must be something we're all benefiting from. What is this national interest? Curiously, it's never defined. But we hear a lot about the special interests. You know who they are? Students, immigrants, refugees, senior citizens, women, African Americans, gays and lesbians, Hispanics. In other words, the bulk of the population. The bulk of the population is a special interest. Let me not forget unions, working people. They are the special interest. And the national interest is something that is just so transcendent that it does not have to be defined. One of the classic definitions here of the unspoken word, imperialism, is this one. Imperialism is the process whereby the dominant investor interests in one country bring to bear their economic and military power upon another nation or region in order to expropriate its land, labor, natural resources, capital, and markets in such a manner as to enrich the investor interests. In a word, empires do not just pursue power for power's sake. There are real and enormous material interests at stake, fortunes to be made many, many times over. That's a definition from Michael Parenti, someone whom I admire greatly, that I've learned much from. But I want to expand that definition a little bit, because it's simply too dry and it's too instrumental in its actual construction. There are many reasons for U.S. violence or use of force, as of course the media would say. And it's not just about oil or natural gas. Yes, those are definite factors in the equation of when the U.S. decides to employ its Roman legions in wars. But there are other factors as well. There's the mafia factor involved here. And that's simply to show anyone that we're the baddest boys on the block. So simply violence for violence sake. Was anyone threatened here by Libya in the 1980s? It was declared a national security threat of the United States, and it was bombed on several occasions. Same thing with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, a national security threat. Noriega's Panama, Maurice Bishop's Grenada. What did Grenada have? Nutmeg? Did the U.S. send 25,000 troops there to conquer nutmeg? So in some instances, the U.S. wants to crush the possibility of any independent alternative from rising and being successful, because that would raise questions about Washington's hegemony. Leader of the free world, another Orwellism. Obama keeps talking about the international community. Great. Again, I feel really warm when I hear that. The international community supports our sanctions against Iran, for example. The international community supports the blockade of Gaza. Well, let's just strip away the onion peels. Who is this international community? With almost no examination, the most cursory of examinations, you find out immediately the international community is the United States and 3 or 4 of its allies. Usually the British, the Israelis, maybe the French, and 1 or 2 others. Don't forget the Marshall Islands, Tonga, Guam, and other heavy hitters from the South Pacific. That's the international community. So when Obama is now lecturing, and he's also called the lecturer-in-chief, when he's lecturing Iran about their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I mean, the irony here is so deep that it simply escapes everyone's attention. Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Three of Washington's closest allies, India, Pakistan, and Israel, are not signatories, are not being held to account, and Iran, which is a signatory, is being carefully scrutinized and monitored. This is all clearly seen outside the U.S., particularly from people who have access to, say, Jazeera and other media that are not as biased and as prejudiced as the U.S., what is now called the lamestream media. And I think literature, and one of the things that brings me here tonight is the publication of my first book with Edward Said called The Pen and the Sword. Literature is also, I think, a very important and significant way to reach people, rather than clinical definitions of imperialism, which is what I just read to you. That was a very clinical definition. But I think to get the flavor of what imperialism is, we should look also at literature. Orwell is very well known for 1984 and Animal Farm, rightly so. Great and imaginative works of art that do talk a lot about imperialism, hegemony, and these issues. But I think his first novel, Burmese Days, is an amazing work that we should pay attention to. Orwell was radicalized in Burma, where he was born in India, educated in private schools, which are called public schools in Britain, and then went out to the empire. That's how they spoke in British English. We're going out to India. And Burma was part of the British Indian Empire at this time. This is in the early 1920s. And Orwell became an imperial policeman. And that's where he saw the workings of imperialism. And he said he was the most hated person in the town where he was. He was the representative of the British Empire. And he's written some fabulous essays about this, such as Shooting an Elephant, for example, and The Hanging. I recommend them both to you. But in this novel, Burmese Days, there's an Indian doctor. His name is Veeraswamy. And this Indian doctor, his main goal was to get into the British club, to become a member, to drink gin and tonic, to speak proper English and read the Illustrated Weekly of England, and, talk about the Queen and the royal family. So he was like obsessed with this doctor. And then there's another character in the book, the main protagonist. His name is Flory, and he was a timber merchant. And finally, Flory, laid it on Dr. Veeraswamy about the realities of British rule in India. And this is what he said to him. "My dear doctor, how can you make out that we, the British, are in Burma for any purpose except to steal? It's so simple. The British official holds the Burman down while the businessman goes through his pockets. Do you suppose my firm, for instance, could get its timber contracts if Burma weren't in the hands of the British? Or the other timber firms, or the oil companies, or the miners and planters and traders? The British Empire is simply a device for giving trade monopolies to the English." And Dr. Veeraswamy, when he heard this, was completely shocked, because he had so internalized the glories of the British Empire, its nobility, its quest for justice, its rule of law, etc. It's worth looking at Burmese Days. And then there's another book, perhaps the single best book on imperialism, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. You may know this as being kind of the rough foundation for Apocalypse Now, the award-winning Francis Ford Coppola film from 1979. But instead of the Congo, where Conrad places Marlowe, the main character, Coppola transforms it to Vietnam, where Martin Sheen plays Marlowe, the same character with the narrative. And Conrad was in the Congo during some of the worst mass killings by the Belgians of the Congolese people. So, again, what is imperialism? This is Marlowe speaking. Aha. I'm not here. It must be the corporate media. Has David started yet? We can't find a parking space. Funny that like the whole CU parking lot is empty, but they can't find a parking space. This is what Marlowe says through Conrad. They were conquerors, and for that you only want brute force. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a grand scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle a darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it, Conrad says through Marlowe, is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, an unselfish belief in something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. So during the British imperial period, it was the white man's burden. And the Americans had manifest destiny, then the open door policy. The French had la mission civilitrice, the civilizing mission. And today the United States, of course, has dropped all of these shibboleths and created the spread of democracy, free markets, liberty, and freedom, all in the name of expansion and domination. And Conrad has a very interesting comment about the British themselves right at the beginning of the book. Before the Nelly, which is the name of the little boat that goes out into the Congo, before it leaves the Thames, the narrator looks out and sees the lights of London lit. And he says, and this too is one of the darkest places on earth. Because he knew what the British were doing in India, in Burma, in Kenya, in much of Africa and Asia. This too is one of the darkest places on earth. So the use of language is interesting in terms of today enhanced intelligence technique. What does that mean? We're all for enhancement, aren't you? We want to enhance our everything we can possibly do. A code word, a euphemism for torture. Death tax. This is created by the right wing and very rich people. So instead of an estate tax, we call it a death tax. Now, we're all going to die at some point, so we must be opposed to a death tax. The other thing, and right in front of us, oil spill. Oil spill. If I spill some coffee, that's a spill. What do you call 5,000 gallons a day? Is there a word in the English language to describe that? Spill? Tragedy? Disaster? Catastrophe? Tsunami? Reform. Another one where, if you ever hear this word, you better reach for your wallet because somebody's probably got their hand in your pocket and is about to pick it. Tax reform. Wall Street reform. Military reform. All of these, code words for restructuring of the existing power relationships, with maybe some little adjustments, just throwing some crumbs to a largely disenchanted, disaffected, and extremely cynical population. And again, going back to Orwell in 1984, it was not desirable that the proles, the workers, should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism which could be appealed to whenever necessary, to accept longer working hours or shorter rations. And even when they became discontented, as they sometimes did, their discontent led nowhere, because without general ideas, they could only focus on petty specific grievances. The larger evils invariably escaped their notice. So let's worry about gay marriage. Let's worry about a few immigrants coming from Mexico and Central America and South America. Many of them economic refugees because of U.S. economic policies, such as NAFTA, which has pauperized the Mexican corn farmers. 2 million have gone belly up and have several choices. They can stay where they are and starve. They can go and live on a footpath and beg in Mexico City or Veracruz or one of the other major cities, or they can go north. Many of them come to the United States. So to focus on distractions, of course, and then we've got, of course, our great free press, which does such an admirable job in deflecting people's attention from reality to fantasy, whether it's Tiger Woods or, what is the latest scandal. It just goes on and on. But I think it's important that, we recognize these things and speak up and reclaim the language. It's a recurrent theme that is repeated over and over again. The U.S. has the authority to use lethal force. Now, this is from a legal ruling, not from Alberto Gonzales, Bush's Attorney General, not from Harold Yu, one of his top legal advisors, not from, who is the other one, Bibi, who's now a judge for life appointed by Bush, not from any of those, but from one of Obama's own high State Department officials, a lawyer, who says the U.S. has the authority to use lethal force in bombing Pakistan. There is no such, this is authority, this is the imperial presidency continuing under Obama. And of course, they have put their hands right into a hornet's nest. And they're now getting bit and will continue to get bit because the Afghans certainly and the Pakistanis are not going to take it. They're not going to take being bombed and being occupied. And we cannot forget about the ongoing tragedy. Tragedy is, again, no word to describe Iraq. 101 Iraqis were killed yesterday. 101. If 1 or 2 Americans die, it's like, whoa. The lead story was 5 Americans were killed in a tornado in Oklahoma. I'm sorry about those 5 Americans. There wasn't any report on the 101 Iraqis. Why? They don't matter. They do not count in the equation of empire. Their lives are worth less. There are worthy and unworthy victims. You hear about, you hear so much about our allies and our casualties, but very little about their casualties. I think we should be paying reparations to the Iraqis, to the Afghans, to the Pakistanis for the damages that we have caused. How can we, not think of paying reparations for the violence inflicted upon them? And I have to sharply disagree with Barack Obama on his characterization of the Iraq war as a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It was a mistake. It was a mistake if I turned right on Euclid instead of left, coming south on Broadway. That's a mistake. This is a war crime of unambiguous proportions. And I was quoted in a Santa Fe newspaper last week, and it stirred up a little bit of, a kerfuffle. I said, how is this different from the German invasion of Norway in 1940? An aggressor state crosses the border of another country. I mean, in this case, there's almost contiguous borders, although not immediately. But a country 8,000 miles away goes to invade another country that is not threatening it. How is it different? As soon as you, of course, inject anything of World War II and Nazis and Nuremberg tribunals, then you see the American nationalists, their hackles go up, their pride, because that was the good war. That was unambiguous. They were evil and we were the righteous. We were the victims, they were the victimizers. Why can't citizens here get their heads around the fact that their state is victimizing other populations? And the reason it's so hard for people to conceptualize that, to just have the space, is because of propaganda, is because of our great free press, not to mention our sterling academic institutions, which produce a large body of political illiterates. I don't know how you could measure political illiteracy. There should be a test on that. We know how to measure literacy, but we don't know how to measure political illiteracy. It would be very, very high here in the United States. And this amnesiac quality, of course, is simply a disaster. I'm looking for another quote, which is not coming up right now, but I can always find something. That's the advantage of being the speaker, which you don't have. And I want to go back to this whole issue of imperialism and the empire of language, empire of words, and the empire of bases. Joseph Schumpeter, not a household name, a great Austrian 20th century sociologist. He wrote an essay in 1919 entitled The Sociology of Imperialism. And as I read this, just substitute United States for every time I say Rome or Romans, and see if there's some resonance. There was no corner of the world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were of Rome's allies. And if Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why then it was the national honor that was insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their aggressive designs. You don't miss a beat, because the pattern of imperialism and domination is rather constant. Slight changes here and there, but they're mostly cosmetic. Now, in Afghanistan, you have one of our rock star generals, Stanley McChrystal, who, along with David Petraeus, another rock star general, who every time they go before a congressional committee, you wonder, who's falling on their knees faster to ask obsequious questions about, to the great generals about the affairs of the state and of Iraq and Afghanistan. But McChrystal had this to say recently: "We have killed an amazing number of Afghans, but to my knowledge, none has ever proven to be a threat." So, here you have an open admission of war crimes atrocities. And what was the response from the free press? A gigantic yawn. And from our great leaders in Congress, 535 of them, nothing. Silence. Rather stunning. You can imagine if Ahmadinejad made such a comment, what the righteous indignation would be, and the invectives and the expletives that would have been cast upon him. When I was in Albuquerque about 10 days ago, Albuquerque, by the way, if it were an independent state, would be the third largest nuclear power in the world. Kirtland Air Force Base has more nukes than all other countries in the world. That is where the Predator drone was designed, by the way. Near to Albuquerque is the Sandia Labs, which is where weapons of mass destruction are designed. New generations of smarter and better nukes. Los Alamos is not that far away. So the bad joke in Albuquerque is that if Albuquerque were an independent country, it would be the third largest nuclear power in the world. So I wanted to talk there to people about the military-industrial complex, and of course talk about Eisenhower. And then, of course, since we live in the United States of amnesia, you have to remind people who Ike was. I'm not kidding you. Not just, the five-star general, commander of all all Allied forces at D-Day, two-time Republican president of Columbia University. Did you know that? From, when in 1947-48, when he was, even being courted by the Democrats who were unhappy with Truman and were pushing the idea of maybe Eisenhower running as a Democrat. And in 1953, I know I'm going to find this before I start, Eisenhower gave a very interesting speech, and I talked about that in Albuquerque. It's his Cross of Iron speech, in which he says, and now I'm going to have to paraphrase, every dollar that is spent is a dollar that is taken away from education, from health, from the needs of ordinary citizens. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life in any true sense. Under the cloud of war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. That was at the very beginning of Eisenhower's administration, April 1953. So while I come here not to praise Ike, let me bury him also, because within 3 months of giving this speech, he destroyed democracy in Iran with Operation Ajax, overthrowing a democratic, popular, liberal, lowercase l, government of Mohammad Mossadegh. And that was followed in short fashion by the overthrow of another democracy in Guatemala in 1954, Jacobo Arbenz. And it went on throughout his administration, trying to overthrow Sukarno in Indonesia, sending U.S. forces into Lebanon, and on and on. But it's interesting that you have these two bookends, where at the very beginning you have the Cross of Iron speech, and then at the very end, when it doesn't count anymore, he gives his farewell address, where he warns the country of the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every state house, city, office of the federal government. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implications, he went on. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. And then in the very next paragraph, which is never quoted, even by people on the left, He says that only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel this military-industrial complex to stop in its, to impel it, to stop it in its tracks. So if Eisenhower were to come back in 2010 and look at the scene, what might he survey? U.S. is the #1 arms trafficker in the world. That's another Orwellism. Our enemies traffic in weapons. We conduct deals. We conduct arms sales for defensive purposes. But they traffic in weapons, So Hezbollah is using weapons snuck in from Lebanon to use in the Middle East. But we are noble, of course, at all times, and we conduct above-board arms deals. The U.S. has 735 military bases and installations around the world. Its trillion-dollar military budget dwarfs all other countries, including China, Britain, Germany, Japan, all the major countries combined. More money is spent by the Pentagon than all of these countries combined. There is a permanent military-industrial complex. And until there is a recognition of that and what its role is, the United States or the people that run the country, sometimes I feel, I don't know what pronoun to use when I say to use we or our country, because when it comes to these matters, we, the people, count for very little. We're asked to march in their parades, wave the flag, turn out and vote every 4 years for this or that candidate with, who argue about tactics, not about principles. Wrong move into Iraq, right move into Afghanistan, more troops into Afghanistan, more bombing over Pakistan, fewer troops in Iraq. Just talking about tactics, never uncovering the embedded assumptions of imperialism, which is the absolute right of the U.S. to intervene in any country at any time, whenever it feels like. And this is, for our population, is just, I think, a devastating situation. William Butler Yeats, the great Irish poet who won the Nobel Prize, he died in 1939. He wrote a poem called The Second Coming. And again, this resonates a lot with what we see today with the right-wing anger, the electronic radio and TV hosts who spew venom and, lie at such an audacious rate that it's simply, it's hard to keep up with the disinformation that is being generated on Goebbels TV, Fox, as well as the talk radio shows. The Second Coming, turning and turning in the winding gyre. Gyre is a spinning motion. I had to look that up. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And now he shifts the scene to Palestine. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indigenous desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. What rough beast an hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. I began with Howard Zinn, and I want to end with Howard Zinn, and also to tell you that alternative radio is heard on KJNU Wednesday evenings at 6. Tomorrow it's going to be the great Arundhati Roy in a speech that I recorded at Harvard on April 1st. Then the week after, Chip Burley, in an interview I did with him when he was here for the World Affairs Conference on the Tea Party movement. There's some of that Yeats poem in there, the Tea Party movement, Chip Burley. That will be followed by Raj Patel on the art of democracy. And we think here in our democratic, America, that it is a democracy because we have elections. But people like Howard Zinn remind us over and over again that elections are just one of the manifestations, one of the instruments of democracy. It doesn't mean that citizens then vote and then go home and it's all over. And you leave it to the rulers to rule, to carry out the policies. Democracy, as Raj Patel in this program suggests, and Howard Zinn as well, is something that's active and ongoing, like what the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center is doing, like what KJNU is doing, and Left Hand Bookstore and the other institutions we have here in Boulder and in Colorado. The Denver Peace and Justice Committee, for example, is another group that's doing terrific work. So democracy is an ongoing thing. It's not just about voting for problematic candidates. And so that's the upcoming alternative radio. Last week, Chomsky was on. He did a program called The Center Cannot Hold, from that Yeats poem that I just read, The Second Coming. So I have that CD here tonight, and a terrific CD by Richard Becker, which probably no one here has heard of. But he did a program. I was really thrilled to discover him in Taos, New Mexico. He gave a talk on myths, empire in the Middle East. And I think it's one of the best descriptions, it's a lecture, of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is not thousands of years old, which is not in the hoary past of ancient, hatreds. It's of rather recent origin. And guess what? The British Empire were at the center of it in terms of parceling out land that they didn't own to people who didn't live there, called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when the people who lived there were never named. They were called the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. Even then, they didn't want to name them. So these two CDs are here, only $10. It would be $36 if you got it from AR's World Corporate Headquarters, which is here in Boulder, Colorado, plus the Howard Zinn book, Original Zinn, the Edward Said book, The Pen and the Sword, which has just been reissued with a great new introduction by Nubar Hovsepian, and Tariq Ali, who was on Democracy Now! This morning, who knows a lot about Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's there. And I have a free postcard, a couple of postcards there, as well as an interview I did for free, a transcript with Nandini Sundar, probably not a household name, an Indian academic. I interviewed her in New Delhi about the uprisings that are going on in India. India is in great turmoil right now, if you don't know about it. About a third of the country is in the throes of some kind of armed rebellion of one form or the other. So that Nandini Sundar interview, the transcript, that's available here as well. Arundhati Roy will be talking about the Indian situation tomorrow on Alternative Radio at 6 o'clock. So Howard Zinn. When we look back at history, yes, we see war and injustice, but we also see people behaving magnificently against great odds, and that encourages us to act. We see that the power of those on top depends on the obedience of the people. When workers go on strike, when consumers boycott, when soldiers refuse to fight, the makers of war, the purveyors of greed, are helpless. We see that the smallest acts multiplied by the millions can lead into great movements of social change. And we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. To live now as human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself the greatest of victories. Thank you very much.